Hello everyone. Tonight we are sailing straight into one of the most unbelievable stories of the ancient world. The time when a ragtag fleet of Greeks stood against the enormous might of Persia. And yes, spoiler alert, you will not survive. Unless, of course, you're just lying in bed, which is the perfect battlefield for this tale. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually like what I do here. I promise. This is more fun than homework, and at least 20% less confusing than your high school history class. Now, I'd love to know where you're watching from, what city, what time it is for you. Drop it in the comments. Personally, I think history is better at 2 AM, but hey, that's just me. Now, turn off the lights. Maybe turn on the fan for some soft background music, and let's get started tonight. The story began with thunder. Not the weather kind, but the kind made by marching boots, rattling spears, and horses snorting under the banners of a king who believed the world should belong to him. His name was Xerxes, ruler of Persia, the most powerful empire the world had ever seen to that point. If his father, Darius, had tried and failed to conquer Greece, then Xerxes was determined to finish the job, and finish it with flair, because nothing said world domination like building a bridge across the sea and a road for an army that seemed to never end. The Persian forces were legendary. According to the ancient writers who loved big numbers almost as much as we love exaggerated YouTube thumbnails, Xerxes commanded anywhere from a few 100,000 to more than 1 million men. Historians still debate whether the true figure was closer to the size of a small city or an entire country. But either way, it was enormous. Imagine trying to organize that many soldiers for dinner. You'd need an all-you-can-eat buffet stretching from Asia to Europe. The army swept west, rolling across the landscape like a storm. They came not only with soldiers but engineers, servants, supply trains, and warships that covered the horizon. It was a sight meant to intimidate, and honestly, it worked. Small Greek city-states, scattered and quarrelsome as ever, suddenly found themselves staring at an empire so vast it made their little marble temples look like dollhouses. But the Greeks had something the Persians didn't: stubbornness. That legendary, immovable, sometimes annoying brand of stubbornness that meant they would argue for days about what to eat for lunch, yet still find a way to come together when the chips were down. Earlier, at Thermopylae, a handful of Spartans and their allies had already shown that Persian power could be slowed, if not stopped. Though they fell, they gave the Greeks time that was more valuable than gold. Because time allowed men like Themistocles, the Athenian politician with a sharp tongue and an even sharper mind, to prepare for what was coming next. The problem was obvious. The Persians had numbers, resources, and momentum. The Greeks had courage, a few clever strategies, and ships, lots of ships. Well, not lots compared to Persia, but enough to make things interesting. And in Themistocles' mind, that was all they needed. Xerxes, however, was not impressed. He looked across the sea toward Greece with the confidence of a man who had never once considered that he might lose. He brought with him his immortals, elite Persian warriors whose very name suggested they were unbeatable. He had chariots, cavalry, archers, slingers, and engineers who could build bridges faster than most Greeks could build an argument. He even had a throne carried along with him, because, why not? If you're going to conquer the world, you might as well do it in comfort, somewhere between Asia Minor and the shores of Greece. The Persian fleet swelled so large that it seemed like the sea itself had sprouted forests of masts. The sails gleamed white in the sunlight, and the oars cut through the water in perfect rhythm, a terrifying metronome of empire. And here's where things get strange. One source claimed that when the Persians built their bridge of boats across the Hellespont, a storm destroyed it. Furious, Xerxes ordered the sea itself whipped with chains, as if Poseidon was going to cower before Persian discipline. Historians still debate whether this was true or a clever jab from Greek storytellers who enjoyed painting Xerxes as a man who thought he could punish the ocean. Honestly, I'd pay to see that: a king standing on the beach, yelling at the waves. Soldiers nervously clapping like it's completely normal. But theatrics aside, Persia's strength was real. Villages along the coast trembled, temples were abandoned, and farmers quietly decided that sheep sounded better on the other side of the mountains. Greek leaders gathered in uneasy councils, arguing about whether to fight on land or at sea, whether to trust Sparta's spears or Athens' ships, whether to sacrifice to the gods or just start running. Through it all, the shadow of Xerxes loomed. He was the kind of ruler who demanded loyalty, obedience, and the occasional human pyramid to show off in parades. His army was unstoppable, his fleet unmatched, and his ambition limitless. To him, the conquest of Greece was not just strategy, it was destiny. But destiny, as we'll soon see, can be slippery, especially when it involves narrow straits, wooden ships, and Greek sailors who really didn't like being told what to do. For now though, picture it, the Persian army marching like a living river of armor and banners, the fleet covering the horizon, and the Greeks looking up at the storm with grim determination. It was the calm before the clash, the thunder before the lightning dot. And remember, dear listeners, you will not survive, but don't worry, neither will Xerxes' grand plan. The Persian army moved like a tidal wave, but the Greeks were not simply standing still, wringing their hands and writing sad poetry. They had Themistocles, and Themistocles had a plan. Now, whether you call him a visionary strategist or just a guy who really liked ships depends on your perspective. But one thing is clear, he was the brains behind what would soon become the most improbable naval showdown of the ancient world. Athens, his beloved city, was in peril. The Persians were advancing, and the Athenians were left with a choice: stay and defend their homes, or take the radical step of abandoning the city entirely. Imagine your mayor announcing, "Good news, everyone, we're leaving town, but don't worry, we'll bring the cat." That's essentially what Themistocles proposed. His idea was simple and shocking: evacuate Athens, put everyone who could row or fight onto ships, and turn the Aegean Sea into a battlefield. Of course, convincing people to leave behind their homes, temples, and family graves was no easy sell. Some Athenians probably thought he had lost his marbles, and yes, those were the same marbles that ended up in the British Museum centuries later. But the looming threat of Xerxes was a great motivator. The Persians were so massive, so unstoppable, that clinging to the city seemed suicidal. And besides, Themistocles had one more ace up his sleeve: the oracle at Delphi. Yes, the oracle. Always vague, always mysterious, and always conveniently open to interpretation. The priestess supposedly told the Athenians that salvation would come from a wooden wall. Now, some folks thought this meant literally building a wall of wood around the Acropolis. Picture a giant picket fence, basically. Others, like Themistocles, interpreted it as a metaphor for ships. The wooden wall is our fleet, he argued. And since people tend to follow whichever interpretation sounds less like a bad DIY project, Themistocles won the day. So Athens was evacuated. Families crammed onto boats, treasures were packed into chests, and sacred objects were carried to safety. The city itself was left eerily empty, a ghost town waiting for the storm. And when the Persians arrived, they wasted no time. They burned, they looted, they toppled statues, and they turned Athens into rubble. For Xerxes, it was a glorious symbol of victory. For the Athenians, it was heartbreak. But for Themistocles, it was just step one of the plan. While Athens smoldered, the Greek fleet gathered near the island of Salamis. Ships came from all over: Corinth, Aegina, Sparta, and of course, Athens. Each city-state sent what they could, and together they formed a coalition that was still dwarfed by Persia's navy. Think of it like a pickup soccer team facing Barcelona. Outnumbered, outmatched, and, let's be honest, probably out of shape. But here's where things get fun. Themistocles knew that a straight-up naval clash in open waters would be suicide. The Persians had numbers on their side, and their ships were sleek, fast, and crewed by experienced sailors from all corners of the empire. The Greeks, meanwhile, had fewer ships and fewer men, but they had one advantage: they knew the geography. The Straits of Salamis were narrow, tricky to maneuver, and perfect for ambushes. This is where Themistocles' genius shone. He basically tricked the Persians into sailing into those cramped waters, where their numerical advantage would become a disadvantage. Imagine trying to park 100 buses in a one-lane alley. It doesn't matter how big your fleet is if half of it can't move. But persuading the Greeks themselves to fight in the straits was another battle. The Spartans wanted to retreat and regroup. Others suggested scattering to defend their individual cities. Herding Greek leaders was like herding cats: loud, proud, argumentative cats. So Themistocles used a trick that would make any politician proud. He lied. He secretly sent a messenger to Xerxes, pretending to betray his fellow Greeks. The message: the Greeks were planning to flee. If Xerxes acted quickly, he could trap them in the straits and destroy them. It was a dangerous gamble. If Xerxes believed him, the Persian king would move his fleet into the exact spot Themistocles wanted. If Xerxes didn't, then the Greek plan would collapse before it even started. Thankfully for Greece and for the future of Western civilization as we know it, Xerxes took the bait. Picture it. The Persian king sitting on his gilded throne overlooking the sea, hearing word that his enemies were about to scatter like frightened rabbits. His pride wouldn't allow it. No, he wanted to crush them all at once, in a single, glorious blow. He ordered his fleet forward. Now, before we dive into the clash, let's pause for one of those delightful oddities of history. One source claimed that the Persians brought so many servants and courtiers with them that during the battles, there were more people on shore watching than actually fighting. Can you imagine the ancient version of sports fans, cheering, jeering, and probably arguing about whose sandals were fancier? Historians still debate whether this detail was exaggerated or not, but if true, it makes the battle sound like a cross between a war and a stadium event. Meanwhile, back at Salamis, Greek sailors were preparing. They sharpened weapons, checked their oars, and prayed to their gods. Some may have been terrified, others exhilarated. And, as always, there were probably a few cracking nervous jokes. After all, if you're about to face down the largest empire in the world, what else can you do but laugh? So, the stage was set. Athens burned behind them, Persia loomed ahead, and the narrow straits of Salamis waited quietly for history to unfold. Themistocles' gamble was about to be tested. And you, dear listener, should probably stay tucked under your blanket, because trust me, you wouldn't survive on one of those wooden walls. Dawn crept over the waters of Salamis, and the straits glimmered in the first light like a polished blade. The Persian fleet had begun to stir. Sails unfurled, oars dipped, and war cries echoed across the sea. They were confident. Why wouldn't they be? They outnumbered the Greeks more than 2-1. To Xerxes, perched on his golden throne overlooking the battlefield, this was not a fight but a spectacle. He wanted to witness the humiliation of his enemies with his own royal eyes. On the Greek side, however, nerves rattled. Sailors whispered prayers, commanders argued about last-minute tactics, and oarsmen shifted restlessly in their benches. Some probably thought of their evacuated families huddled on nearby islands, waiting for news. Others likely wondered whether the oracles had meant this wooden wall, or if they had all made a colossal mistake. As always, historians still debate whether the Greek fleet had ironclad confidence, or were one collective stomachache waiting to happen. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. Then came the rallying cry. Across the fleet, heralds shouted commands, horns blared, and the Greek ships rowed forward in unison. Their wooden hulls creaked, their bronze rams gleamed, and the oars cut into the water with rhythm. This was not the open sea. This was a funnel of death where numbers would count for less than maneuverability. The Greeks were betting everything on their cramped home turf. The Persian fleet surged in, trying to force its way into the straits. But almost immediately, chaos broke out. The narrow waters became a nightmare. Ships bumped and collided, oars snapped, and captains screamed orders that no one could hear above the din. Imagine the worst traffic jam you've ever been stuck in. Now add arrows, spears, and flaming projectiles. That was the Battle of Salamis. Themistocles' gamble paid off brilliantly. Greek triremes darted through the clutter, ramming Persian vessels with precision. Bronze-tipped rams tore into wooden hulls, splintering them apart. Persian ships, too tightly packed to maneuver, became easy targets. The Greeks rowed backward just as quickly as they rowed forward, striking, retreating, and striking again. It was like a deadly game of bumper boats, except no one was laughing, except maybe Themistocles, who was surely thinking, see, wooden walls for the win. And here's where we pause for one of those odd details. Ancient writers tell us that Artemisia, the queen of Halicarnassus and one of Xerxes' commanders, fought with ferocity, but also with cunning. At one point, to escape a pursuing Greek ship, she rammed and sank another Persian vessel. The Greeks saw this and assumed she must be on their side, so they stopped chasing her. Meanwhile, her actual allies, now at the bottom of the sea, probably weren't so impressed. Historians still debate whether this maneuver was pure accident or a stroke of genius, but either way, Artemisia survived while many Persian captains did not. The fighting raged all morning. From his throne, Xerxes watched as ship after ship of his vast navy sank or drifted, crippled. What was meant to be a display of his unstoppable power was turning into a watery disaster. He had expected the Greeks to break and scatter. Instead, they fought like lions. At one point, Legend claims that the sea was so clogged with wreckage and bodies that sailors could practically walk across it. Gruesome image, yes, but don't worry. This is bedtime storytelling, so let's just imagine it as an ancient version of a floating obstacle course. Meanwhile, Greek sailors shouted with triumph, pounding their oars on the decks, while others broke into battle song. You have to admire their spirit, fighting for survival and still managing a soundtrack. And yes, there were also plenty of nervous jokes exchanged, because sometimes laughter is the only weapon you've got against fear. I imagine one sailor saying, "Well, at least if we sink, the Persians will never find our sandals." By midday it was clear. The Persian fleet was shattered. Dozens of ships were wrecked, and morale collapsed faster than a badly built sandal. Xerxes, furious and humiliated, abandoned his golden view seat and began plotting his retreat. The once invincible navy had been cut to pieces by a smaller, scrappier force that refused to play by the rules of conventional warfare. The Greeks, battered but victorious, pulled back to regroup. Smoke rose from broken ships, the cries of the wounded carried over the water, and exhausted sailors slumped against their benches, barely able to lift their oars. But they had done it. Against all odds, they had turned the tide. Themistocles' trickery, their courage, and the narrow straits of Salamis had saved them. And yet, as the sun dipped low, they knew the war wasn't over. Xerxes still had a massive army on land, and the Persians weren't going to pack up and go home just because of one naval setback. No, this was just one chapter in a longer struggle. But for now, the Greeks allowed themselves a moment of celebration. They had survived the storm, and the improbable fleet had proven its worth. And you, curled up listening, should probably celebrate too. Because if you'd been rowing on one of those triremes, let's be honest, you would not have lasted 5 minutes. The day after Salamis dawned unusually quiet. The sea, still littered with broken timbers and floating debris, bore silent witness to the chaos of the battle. Fishermen from nearby islands later claimed they found bronze helmets tangled in their nets for weeks afterward. It wasn't just a naval clash, it was a storm that had torn apart the illusion of Persian invincibility. The Greeks, though victorious, were exhausted. Oarsmen lay sprawled on the decks of their triremes, muscles trembling from hours of rowing. Commanders walked among them, offering words of encouragement, and perhaps also reminding them that a stiff drink of watered wine would be more comforting than lying motionless in despair. It was, in every sense, a fragile victory. Meanwhile, Xerxes was seething. The great king of Persia had brought his mighty fleet to Greece, expecting obedience, not resistance. From his vantage point on the shore, he had witnessed a disaster unfold, not a heroic saga, at least from his perspective. He had to make a choice: press forward and risk losing even more, or retreat to preserve what remained of his empire's dignity. Ancient sources say he built a throne of gold on the shoreline so he could watch his navy destroy the Greeks, only to end up watching his navy destroy itself instead. Somewhere, Themistocles must have been smirking at the irony. Yet, in typical Persian fashion, Xerxes didn't immediately admit defeat. Instead, he sent his generals scrambling to find excuses. Some blamed bad omens, others pointed fingers at the cramped geography. At least one scribe may have suggested, perhaps building a floating bridge across the Hellespont wasn't the most practical long-term plan. Historians still debate whether Xerxes truly believed the gods had turned against him, or if he was just saving face in front of his court. Either way, it was not the triumphant conquest he had envisioned. On the Greek side, Themistocles wasted no time. He called councils, spread rumors, and even sent misleading messages to confuse Xerxes further. If the Persians wanted to regroup, he wanted them doubting themselves at every step. Oddly enough, one story claims he even sent a friendly messenger to Xerxes, suggesting that the Greeks were planning to attack the bridge over the Hellespont. Themistocles knew exactly what would happen. Xerxes panicked, might retreat faster than a mouse spotting a cat. And yes, it worked. Sometimes a rumor can sink a fleet more effectively than a ram of bronze. Life in the Greek camp, though, wasn't just strategy and seriousness. Soldiers, as they always do, found ways to joke about their narrow escape. One comic playwright supposedly made light of the Persians' obsession with luxury, comparing their silken robes to sails that ripped too easily. Others may have teased Themistocles himself. Sure, the plan worked, but next time maybe don't wait until the last second to tell us. If you've ever worked with a boss who announces a surprise deadline, you can probably sympathize with those sailors. And then there's the peculiar story of the Persian eunuch. According to one later account, Xerxes had a trusted eunuch advisor who tried to calm him after the battle by reciting poetry. Whether or not this is true, the image is striking. The great king of Persia, sulking after his navy's humiliation, soothed by rhymes about destiny and fate. Historians still debate whether this tale was propaganda, exaggeration, or just too poetic to be dismissed. Either way, it's a reminder that even emperors needed bedtime stories. As the days passed, Xerxes made his decision. He would leave part of his army under the command of Mardonius to continue the fight in Greece, but he himself would return to Asia. Some say it was because his advisors urged him to protect the empire's heartland. Others suggest he simply wanted to avoid further embarrassment. After all, being called the king who ran away from a bunch of fishermen with boats doesn't look great on a resume for the Greeks. This was both a relief and a warning. They had won a staggering victory at Salamis, but the Persians were not gone. Their armies still marched across the land, and the specter of another clash loomed large. If anything, Salamis had bought them time, precious time to regroup, rebuild, and pray that their improbable fleet would not be needed again too soon. And you, dear listener, should remember, this wasn't just the story of oars, rams, and burning ships. It was a tale of fear, cunning, and the bizarre twists of history, like how Artemisia rammed her own side, or how rumors became weapons sharper than swords. It's also a reminder that sometimes the underdog doesn't just survive, they bite back hard enough to shake an empire. So, the Sea of Salamis fell quiet again, carrying whispers of both triumph and dread. The Greeks had shown what determination could do, but the war was not finished. In fact, the next battles would decide the fate of the entire conflict. But that, of course, is a story for another night, and trust me, if you were rowing at Salamis, you wouldn't have lasted even through the warm-up exercises. News of the Persian retreat spread like wildfire across the Greek world, and for once, the smoke in the distance wasn't from burning temples. Themistocles, ever the strategist, knew that Salamis had been only one act in a much larger drama. The Persians had retreated, yes, but Mardonius, the seasoned general left behind, was preparing to strike again. If Greece thought it could rest easy, it had another thing coming, though honestly, after months of rowing, fighting, and hiding under burning timbers, even a nap would have been well deserved. The Spartans, never ones to let the Athenians hog the spotlight, reminded everyone that their hoplites had stood strong at the moment. Even if that particular episode ended with more spears in the Spartans than in the Persians, Athens, on the other hand, argued that without their fleet, Greece would already be decorating Persian palaces. In short, it was the ancient equivalent of a Twitter argument, only louder and with more bronze helmets involved. Athens had been burned once already by the Persians, and its people were still displaced, living in makeshift camps and villages scattered through the countryside. It was not exactly the kind of setting where you'd want to throw a neighborhood barbecue, but what Athenians lacked in home comfort, they made up for in determination. Rebuilding could wait. Survival came first, and besides, the sight of their city in ashes gave them a rather convenient rallying cry. We have nothing left to lose, except maybe another roof. Mardonius, meanwhile, had his own problems. He needed to entice the Greeks into open battle, but they weren't exactly eager to meet his vast army head. So, in true Persian style, he tried diplomacy. He sent envoys to Athens, offering favorable terms if they would abandon the alliance and side with Persia. The Athenians, perhaps still choking on the smoke of their own ruins, laughed the envoys out of town. The terms might have been generous, but the scars of betrayal at Thermopylae and the memory of Salamis made the choice simple. Better to stand defiant and homeless than submit with silk-lined comfort. Historians still debate whether the Athenian leaders actually threatened to throw the Persian envoys off a cliff, or whether that was just later storytelling flair. Either way, the message was clear. Athens would not betray Greece. You can almost imagine the Spartan reaction to hearing this news. Well, maybe the Athenians do have spines after all. And so the two sides prepared for yet another confrontation, one that would unfold not on the sea, but on the plains of Boeotia. The stage was set for Plataea, but before that, the Greeks squabbled among themselves about who would lead, who would provide supplies, and whether there would be enough wine to keep morale high. Some things never change. Put too many leaders in one room, and you'll have more arguing than planning. Of course, the oddities of wartime life continued to crop up. One peculiar account claims that Greek soldiers, while foraging for supplies, stumbled upon a shrine where mice were gnawing at Persian offerings. They took it as a sign from the gods that Persia's wealth would be nibbled away. Personally, I think it was just a very satisfied mouse enjoying its best day ever. But hey, omens are omens. Themistocles, for his part, found himself both praised as a savior and criticized as a schemer. Some Greeks admired his cleverness at Salamis, others accused him of arrogance. Imagine being the guy who saved the entire alliance, only to have your co-workers complain about your attitude at meetings. That, dear listener, is the eternal fate of geniuses with slightly smug grins. Meanwhile, Mardonius camped in Thessaly, trying to lure the Greeks into a decisive engagement. His camp was said to be filled with luxury, golden pavilions, silken cushions, even cooks preparing elaborate feasts. One Spartan visiting as an envoy reportedly laughed at the absurdity, remarking that it was odd anyone surrounded by so much soft living could possibly want to fight. And maybe, just maybe, that Spartan had a point. War, after all, is rarely won by the side with the fancier couches, yet behind the humor and the posturing, a grim truth remained. The Persians still had numbers on their side, and Greece, divided as ever, risked collapsing under pressure. If Plataea went wrong, Salamis would be remembered as a lucky accident, rather than the turning point of a war. The stakes were higher than ever, and each city-state knew that hesitation could spell disaster. So, as spring crept towards summer, both armies gathered strength. Farmers tilled their fields nervously, wondering if they'd soon be trampled under bronze sandals. Priests sacrificed animals, interpreting entrails with grim expressions. And across the land, stories spread. The gods had favored the Greeks at Salamis, but would they grant them another miracle on land? Historians still debate whether omens really swayed commanders, or whether they simply offered excuses when things went badly. Either way, it gave everyone something to talk about while sharpening their spears. In the end, Greece stood once more on the edge of catastrophe and hope, teetering like a trireme in rough waters. The Persians were not finished, the Greeks were not united, and the war was far from over. But one thing was certain: the fight that was coming next would decide. More than who controlled Boeotia, it would determine whether Greece remained free or bowed beneath the shadow of the great King. And if you think rowing for hours at Salamis sounded exhausting, wait until you have to march across dusty plains in full bronze armor. Trust me, your feet would quit before the battle even started. The summer sun beat down upon the plains of Boeotia, and with it came the thunder of marching feet. Both the Greeks and the Persians converged near the small town of Plataea, and suddenly the stage for one of the greatest land battles of antiquity was set. Farmers who had once prayed for rain now prayed for survival, and anyone with a mule tried to sell it to the armies for an outrageous price. Truly, wartime inflation was nothing new. The Persian general Mardonius was confident. His camp stretched across the plains like a city of silk, complete with gold vessels, exotic animals, and enough food stores to feed an army for months. To Greek eyes, it looked like the most lavish traveling circus ever assembled. Meanwhile, the Greek coalition, Athenians, Spartans, Corinthians, and more, was much less impressive in terms of material wealth. Their camp looked more like a farmer's market that had been hastily fortified, with tents patched from whatever scraps of cloth could be found. If one side had luxury, the other had stubbornness, which in Greek warfare was often the more valuable asset. The Greeks gathered, under the overall command of the Spartan Pausanias, a man who carried himself with the stiff dignity of someone who believed his city-state's way of life was the only way of life. The Athenians grumbled about Spartan arrogance. The Spartans mocked Athenian love of words and debate, and the smaller allies just tried not to get crushed in the middle. If you've ever tried organizing a group project in school with 15 people who all think they're the smartest one, you've basically seen the Greek alliance in action. Mardonius, however, faced problems of his own. His troops, though numerous, were a mix of Persians, Medes, and allied Greeks who weren't exactly enthusiastic about fighting their countrymen. Loyalty in his camp was as fragile as a clay pot in a thunderstorm. Still, his cavalry gave him an advantage, and he hoped to provoke the Greeks into leaving their strong positions. The battle did not begin immediately. Instead, there were days of skirmishes, cavalry raids, and supply troubles. The Persian horsemen cut off Greek access to water, which, as you can imagine, quickly turned into a rather sweaty crisis. Nothing motivates men to move faster than the absence of fresh drinking water in midsummer. Pausanias, realizing the danger, ordered a repositioning under cover of night. Unfortunately, in the confusion, some Greek contingents strayed, others stalled, and what should have been an orderly withdrawal turned into something resembling an ancient traffic jam. When dawn broke, Mardonius thought the Greeks were retreating in panic. Sensing his opportunity, he threw his army into pursuit. But here's the thing about underestimating Greeks: it rarely ends well. The Spartans and their allies halted, turned, and prepared to stand firm. In the ensuing clash, the shield walls held, and suddenly it was not the Greeks who looked cornered, but the Persians. One curious story from this battle involves a bird, a small owl, sacred to Athena, that supposedly flew above the Greek lines as the Persians advanced. The soldiers took it as a divine omen that the goddess was with them. Whether or not the owl was truly there, historians still debate. Personally, I like to think some very confused bird just happened to wander into the wrong battlefield and unwittingly became a symbol of divine favor. The fighting itself was brutal, though we'll spare the gory details. Imagine thousands of bronze-clad men pushing against each other, spears thrusting, shields locked, dust rising, and the cries of commanders trying to be heard over the clash of iron. In the chaos, Mardonius himself was struck down reportedly by a Spartan warrior wielding a massive stone. It was, shall we say, not the most glamorous end for a man of such high command, but effective nonetheless. Once Mardonius fell, Persian morale collapsed. The luxurious camp that had once been the pride of the empire was stormed by the Greeks, who, upon seeing the gold cups and silken tents, probably realized for the first time just how wealthy their enemies truly were. Some accounts say the Spartans mocked the Persians' extravagance, pointing out that men who lived like this had been defeated by soldiers who dined on barley and onions. Not exactly Michelin star dining, but it did the job. In the aftermath, the Greeks argued, as they always did, about who deserved credit for the victory. The Spartans insisted their discipline had won the day. The Athenians pointed out that their quick maneuvers and clever positioning had been critical. The smaller city-states just tried to shout loudly enough to be remembered in the records. It was the ancient equivalent of fighting over who gets their name listed first in a group project report. Meanwhile, back at the Persian camp, odd stories circulated. One claimed that a captured fortune-teller had warned Mardonius of disaster, but had been ignored. Another said Persian cooks, who had once prepared lavish banquets, now wandered dazed, their kitchens reduced to ruins. Strange, too, were the Greek soldiers marveling at Persian luxuries, golden couches, jeweled ornaments, even perfumes. For men accustomed to simple cloaks and sandals, it was like stepping into a fantasy. And yet, all the silk in the world could not buy victory. The Battle of Plataea was a turning point. Persia's dream of conquering mainland Greece had crumbled in dust and bronze. Still, the war was not quite finished. Naval operations would continue, and Persian influence lingered. But at Plataea, the Greeks had proven that united, however messily, they could stand against the might of the empire. And if you think this was the end of the squabbling among allies, think again. For Greeks, victory was never just about survival. It was also about bragging rights. And bragging, let me assure you, was one arena where they never lost. While the plains of Plataea were still echoing with the clash of shields and the shouting of victors, events at sea were quietly ensuring the Persian dream would not rise again. The Aegean, with its sparkling blue waters and deceptively calm horizons, became the stage for one final act of defiance. If Plataea had been the hammer blow, then the Battle of Mycale was the finishing strike that shattered Persian hopes. The Greek fleet, still buzzing with pride after Salamis, and with fresh confidence from Plataea, now turned its attention eastward. The Persians, battered yet not entirely broken, had stationed a fleet near the coast of Asia Minor, hoping to protect their foothold. What they didn't expect was the sheer determination of the Greeks to chase them down. You know that feeling when you win a board game, and instead of packing up nicely, you keep rolling dice just to prove you've really won. That's essentially what the Greeks were doing. The Persians anchored their ships near Mount Mycale, close enough to the shore that they could use land forces to guard them. They even dragged many ships onto the beach, building a fortified camp around them. It was like saying, "We dare you to come and get us." The Greeks, never ones to resist a dramatic challenge, promptly accepted. Under the leadership of Leotychides the Spartan and Xanthippus the Athenian, the fleet moved in. Before the battle began, a strange rumor spread among the Greek sailors. word of the victory at Plataea had somehow reached them. Even though the battle had been fought on the same day, was it divine intervention, a fast messenger, or simply a morale-boosting fib? Historians still debate, but the effect was immediate. The Greek rowers and hoplites believed the gods had granted them a double triumph. Nothing boosts confidence like thinking the universe itself is on your side. The engagement was fierce. As the Greeks stormed the Persian camp, the battle turned from a naval contest to a land assault. Hoplites clashed with Persian infantry among the makeshift walls and burned ships. The smell of pitch, smoke, and seawater filled the air. Greek shields gleamed with sunlight and ash, while Persian archers rained arrows from behind barricades. One chronicler claimed the sound of splintering ships and shouting men echoed like a thunderstorm, rolling down the mountainside. In the chaos, the Persians tried to rally, but morale collapsed quickly once their camp began to burn. Imagine watching your entire fleet, those carefully built triremes, turn into bonfires. It was less a battle at that point, and more of an evacuation. For the Greeks, it was both terrifying and strangely exhilarating. Nothing says we won quite like watching the enemy's warships go up in flames. There was also, as always, a curious little detail. Some sources claim that just before the fighting started, an old seer in the Greek camp performed a sacrifice and declared that the omens were good. The sacrificial animal, however, reportedly sneezed at the exact moment the declaration was made. The Greeks took it as a sign of divine approval. Personally, I suspect the poor beast had dust in its nose. But hey, in times of war, a sneeze can become a prophecy. By the end of the day, the Persian camp at Mycale was destroyed, their fleet either burned or captured, and the survivors fleeing inland. For the Greeks, the victory was more than just another triumph. It symbolized the liberation of Greek cities in Asia Minor. Ionian Greeks, long under Persian rule, were suddenly freer, at least free enough to celebrate without paying taxes to a distant king. But of course, victory brought its own squabbles. The Athenians argued they deserved credit for their seamanship, while the Spartans insisted it was their steady leadership that carried the day. Smaller allies like Samos and Chios, who had risked much to support the revolt, loudly demanded recognition. And yes, if you're sensing déjà vu, it's because Greek alliances always work this way. You could practically set your sundial by the timing of their arguments. As the flames of the Persian camp died down, the Greek soldiers scavenged what they could: bronze, timber, supplies, and then returned to their ships. They knew, deep down, that something monumental had just occurred. No longer was the war about mere survival. They had struck so deeply into the Persian war machine that the empire itself felt the blow. From Marathon to Salamis, from Plataea to Mycale, the Greeks had defied overwhelming odds. A patchwork of city-states, usually more eager to argue than to cooperate, had stood together against the largest empire of their age, and somehow, improbably, they had won. Still, questions lingered in the salty Aegean air. How long could this fragile unity last? Would the Persians accept defeat, or come back with renewed force? Historians still debate whether this was truly the end of the Greco-Persian wars, or just a pause in an endless cycle. But for the men who fought that day, standing on the smoky shores of Mycale, watching the embers of enemy ships drift into the sky, there was no question. For the first time in a long time, the sea felt like it belonged to Greece. When the last smoke from the burning ships at Mycale faded into the late summer sky, the Greeks might have expected a calm, triumphant silence. Instead, what followed was, well, exactly what you'd expect from a coalition of fiercely independent city-states who all wanted to take credit. If you've ever tried to divide a pizza among a group of teenagers, you already understand the atmosphere after Mycale. The Spartans were quick to say, without our leadership, the fleet would have been lost. The Athenians, naturally, rolled their eyes and pointed out that they had provided most of the ships, the sailors, and, let's be honest, the clever ideas. Islanders like the Samians insisted they were the bravest for defecting from Persia when things could have gone badly. And the Ionians, they were just thrilled to see their cities suddenly liberated, though some weren't so sure what being liberated by Athens might mean in the long run. But despite the bickering, something important had shifted. The Greeks had not just defended themselves, they had carried the fight across the sea. They had taken the offensive, and that meant they had a taste for something new: influence, expansion, and maybe even empire. Historians still debate whether the seeds of Athenian imperial ambition were planted here, at Mycale, or a little later, but the whispers of future power struggles were already in the air. The Persians, for their part, scrambled to regroup, though their fleet had been reduced to ash and splinters. The empire itself was vast, and they weren't about to pack up entirely. Garrisons remained in Asia Minor, and Persian satraps still had plenty of men under their command. But morale was low. Persian commanders, looking back toward Susa and Persepolis, had to wonder how they would explain the disaster to Xerxes. It's never a good day when your excuse boils down to, "The Greeks sneezed on us, and we lost." Meanwhile, on the Greek side, celebration didn't mean calm reflection, it meant loud feasts, messy toasts, and exaggerated retellings of battles. Every sailor who had pulled an oar suddenly claimed he had personally rammed 3 enemy triremes. Every hoplite swore he had faced down 10 Persian archers with nothing but a dented shield. If Instagram had existed, the flood of battle selfies would have crashed the server. But alongside the jokes and the wine, serious questions loomed. Should the Greeks keep pressing the war deeper into Persian territory, or should they call it finished and go home? The Spartans, famously practical and rather uninterested in overseas adventures, leaned toward going home. They had farms, helots, and domestic affairs to manage. Athens, on the other hand, looked eastward and saw opportunity. If Persia could be beaten on its own shores, why not keep pushing? After all, someone had to protect the liberated Ionians, and Athens was more than happy to volunteer, provided they could collect a little tribute in return. A curious episode followed, often overlooked in the shadow of great battles. Some Ionian cities, uncertain whether to trust Athens or risk falling back under Persian control, offered to uproot themselves entirely and move to mainland Greece. The Spartans thought this was a brilliant idea. Fewer allies to protect overseas, fewer excuses to maintain a navy. Athens, however, vetoed the plan. The Athenians argued that the Ionian Greeks should stay put, keep their lands, and resist Persia where they were. A cynic might add that Athens saw in them a future block of allies and sources of revenue, even in victory. The differences between Athens and Sparta glared like torchlight at a night festival. They had marched and rode side by side, but their visions of the future were not the same. One wanted stability and tradition, the other saw destiny on the horizon. This tension would not vanish. In fact, it would only grow. You could almost hear the faint ticking of a clock counting down to another famous conflict, one that had nothing to do with Persia. Yet, in the autumn air after Mycale, unity still held just enough to allow one last surge of cooperation. A joint force sailed to the Hellespont, where the Persians still held important bridges and crossings. The Greeks intended to tear down what remained of Xerxes' grand engineering projects. But by the time they arrived, they found the bridges already destroyed, whether by storm or by Persians themselves. Nobody could say for sure. Historians still debate whether this anticlimax was a case of divine humor or simple bad luck. So, the Greeks turned back. For the Spartans, it was an easy decision. Time to return home. For the Athenians, the taste of empire was already sweet, and the dream of controlling the seas was no longer fantasy. Victory, ironically, had brought new questions, new rivalries, and new ambitions. But that night, after the fires of Mycale had cooled, Greek soldiers and sailors gathered on the beaches to feast. They roasted meat, poured wine, and sang songs of victory. Someone inevitably started a tune about the strange sneeze that foretold the battle, and before long everyone was laughing. It's hard to stay somber when your official prophecy involves livestock allergies. As stars flickered above the Aegean, the men must have felt that something larger than themselves had shifted. Persia, the giant that once seemed unstoppable, had been driven back. Greece, small, divided, often bickering, had stood its ground and even struck a blow abroad. And while the future would bring more struggles, more debates, and even wars among themselves, for this moment, under the starlight and the fading smell of smoke, they were united. Back in Athens, the victory celebrations rolled on like an endless wine fountain. If you've ever been to a party that starts as a quiet dinner and ends with people dancing on the table, you'll understand the mood in the city after news of Salamis, Plataea, and Mycale trickled in. The Athenians, always good at storytelling, stretched their triumphs into epics before the ink was even dry, and, in classic Athenian fashion, they began thinking less about defense and more about opportunity. It was around this time that the idea of a permanent naval alliance began to take shape. The Greeks had tasted the sweet relief of collective action, and though they grumbled about each other, they knew that unity had worked against Persia. So why not keep it going? Of course, Athens proposed this, and if you guessed that Athens would also insist on leading it, congratulations, you know you're Athenians. This idea grew into what later became known as the Delian League, a grand coalition meant to defend the Aegean from future Persian aggression. The treasury was set on the sacred island of Delos, halfway between east and west, as a symbolic neutral center. Tribute poured in from the islands and coastal cities, sometimes willingly, sometimes with a little persuasion. The Persians might still loom across the sea, but more and more, people started to notice that Athens was the one issuing the instructions and collecting the silver. Sparta, meanwhile, wanted no part of this scheme. They preferred the security of their landlocked Peloponnesus and their endless worries about Helot uprisings. To them, constant naval patrols and overseas campaigns sounded exhausting, expensive, and not to put too fine a point on it, just not very Spartan. So, politely but firmly, the Spartans excused themselves from this league. It was like bowing out of a group project while muttering, "Good luck with that, I'll be over here lifting weights." Historians still debate whether Athens, at this moment, truly envisioned an empire or if they simply stumbled into it. After all, protecting allies often comes with responsibilities: ships to send, garrisons to build, taxes to collect, and once you're in the business of collecting tribute, it's a slippery slope to telling people what they can and can't do. Before long, Athens would find itself less a defender of freedom and more a bossy landlord. But for the moment, in the glow of recent victories, the project looked noble. Athens promised to keep Persia at bay, and the smaller cities agreed. It must have felt reassuring to those tiny islands, knowing that a fleet of sleek triremes stood ready to protect them. Less reassuring, perhaps, was the realization that those same ships could also show up if they tried to back out. Oddly enough, this was also the age when Athens began a wave of rebuilding. The Persians had burned much of the city during their occupation, and though the wounds still showed, Athenians saw the ruins not as scars but as invitations to greatness. New walls were planned, stronger and taller, connecting the city to its port at Piraeus. This idea of long walls ensured Athens would always be tied to the sea, always fed and supplied, no matter what. The irony was delicious. The Persians had wanted to crush Athens, but their invasion had instead inspired a city to reinvent itself into something more powerful than ever. Of course, not everything was glorious. Odd details surface in the chronicles, like the story of an Athenian general who insisted that sailors wear matching cloaks for discipline only, to discover that half the men sold their cloaks at the next market for wine money, or the persistent problem of rowers using battle songs as excuses to avoid timing their strokes. Historians still debate whether these were exaggerations or not, but given human nature, I'm leaning toward absolutely true. Meanwhile, Persia was not gone. Though their fleets had been humbled, the empire still had vast reserves of men and money. Satraps along the coast continued to menace rebellious cities, and Persian envoys were always eager to stir trouble. The Greeks knew this. The Delian League was not built from paranoia alone. Somewhere, over the horizon, Persian kings and generals were regrouping, waiting for a chance to test the fragile Greek alliance. But if the Persians had hoped to see Greece collapse in squabbling right after the war, they must have been disappointed. For once, the fractious city-states seemed oddly aligned. Not united in love, no, that would be too much to ask, but united in the sense that Persia had humiliated them once and should never have ever be allowed to do so again. It was less like a family and more like co-workers who hate each other but still show up because the boss is watching. That night in Athens, under new torchlight and scaffolding rising from the ruins, the city buzzed with ambition. They toasted to freedom, yes, but also to influence, wealth, and power. And somewhere in the laughter and cheers, in the clink of silver cups, the shape of an empire could already be heard forming. If Athens was a person, this was the moment they discovered eyeliner, a gym membership, and an online following all at once. With their fleet stronger than ever, walls rising higher by the day, and a treasury jingling with tribute from allies, Athens strutted across the Aegean like it had just one most likely to succeed in the yearbook. The Delian League wasn't just a coalition anymore. It was starting to look suspiciously like an Athenian empire in everything but name. The allies noticed. Some island states, initially grateful for protection, began muttering about the cost. They had signed up to fight Persia, not to bankroll Athenian building projects and festivals, but Athens had an answer to grumbling: more ships. If you refused to pay tribute, you might find 30 triremes politely docking in your harbor, asking well, insisting that you reconsider. You could call it persuasion, though it came with spears and shields. Meanwhile, Sparta was sulking in the Peloponnesus. The Spartans claimed they didn't care about Athenian ambition, but their constant glares across the isthmus suggested otherwise. They had been the heroes of Thermopylae, the champions at Plataea, and yet Athens now seemed to bask in all the glory. Worse still, Spartan culture prized simplicity and discipline, while Athens was busy spending tribute on temples, art, and gasp theatre festivals. If the Persians had hoped to divide Greece by arms, it looked like Greek pride and jealousy might do the job for them. One of the stranger details from this era is the tale of the island of Thasos, which revolted against Athens partly over mining rights. Yes, gold and silver mines. The Athenians crushed the rebellion, confiscated the mines, and absorbed the revenue. Historians still debate whether the revolt was mainly about resources or simply Athens being bossy, but either way, it set the tone. Athens wasn't just a protector anymore, it was the landlord who also ate your food at sea. However, the Athenians truly shone. Their navy had become the envy of the Mediterranean. Sleek wooden warships rowed by thousands of oarsmen, who trained until their arms must have looked like braided ropes. If you think rowing is boring, imagine doing it to a drum beat while arrows whistle overhead and your commander yells that if you mess up the rhythm, you'll be the reason the Persians win. Motivation at its finest. Of course, sailors are sailors, and they found ways to misbehave. One chronicle mentions crews painting eyes on the front of triremes for protection. Another mentions them sneaking pet monkeys aboard apparently to entertain the rowers. Picture it, hundreds of exhausted men trying to row in time while a mischievous monkey runs up and down the deck. Historians still debate whether this really happened or if it was just sailors' tall tales. But honestly, who wouldn't believe it? Athens, flush with success, even began sending expeditions further afield. Campaigns touched Egypt, the coast of Asia Minor, and beyond. Some succeeded, others ended disastrously. But the mere fact that Athens was thinking this big shows how confident the city had become. It was no longer content to defend Greece. It wanted to shape the eastern Mediterranean. Sparta, of course, watched all this with growing unease. To them, Athens looked like a reckless younger sibling who had just discovered fireworks. Sure, it's fun, but eventually someone's house is going to catch fire. The uneasy peace between Athens and Sparta, forged during the Persian invasions, began to fray. You could almost hear the drumbeat of another war approaching, not against Persia this time, but between Greeks themselves. Still, the ordinary Athenians lived in a strange mix of prosperity and anxiety. Tribute kept food cheap and festivals lavish, but everyone knew Persia wasn't gone. The great king still sat in Susa, commanding endless wealth and soldiers, and rumors swirled that he plotted revenge. Whether that was true or just tavern gossip, nobody knew for sure. Historians still debate whether Persian envoys actively stirred trouble in Greece during these years, but it wouldn't be out of character, so Athens kept rowing, kept building, and kept celebrating. They told themselves they were protecting freedom, though the smaller allies muttered under their breath. And somewhere in the back of every Greek's mind, one question lingered: was Athens saving them from Persia, or setting them up for something entirely different? If Athens had been riding high before, the mid-5th century was the moment it decided to push its luck just a little too far. Picture a gambler who'd won big at the dice table, then cheerfully said, "Let's double it." That gambler was Athens, and the dice table was the entire eastern Mediterranean. Flush with silver, tribute, and confidence, Athens began sending fleets far beyond its traditional waters. One ambitious campaign headed to Egypt, where rebels sought to shake off Persian rule. The Athenians saw an opportunity: weaken Persia, gain an ally, and maybe control a bit of the Nile trade while they were at it. On parchment, it looked brilliant. In reality, not so much. The Egyptian campaign turned into a disaster. For years the Athenians held on, fighting desperately along the Nile, but Persian reinforcements eventually crushed them. Ships were lost, soldiers stranded, and the dream of an Egyptian foothold sank like a trireme with holes in it. Back in Athens, people had to spin the story as a noble effort. It's the ancient equivalent of telling your parents that failing math class built character. Meanwhile, at home, Athens kept building. Temples gleamed, markets bustled, and new laws and debates filled the agora. The city loved to argue about everything, from philosophy to fish prices. One strange detail recorded by a later historian is that some Athenians complained loudly about the quality of imported garlic. Yes, garlic. While empires clashed, people still grumbled about groceries. Some things never change, but the true center of Athenian power was still its navy. The triremes, sleek as ever, patrolled the Aegean. Rowers trained constantly, their muscles knotting into cords that could probably crush walnuts. The commanders, meanwhile, learned the art of maneuvering fleets like chess pieces on water. And, as usual, the sailors found time for mischief. One account suggests that crews held singing competitions mid-voyage, with the losing team forced to scrub the deck. Imagine a rowing choir that could sink ships with its volume alone. All the while, Sparta brooded. The Persians may have been the official enemy, but the Spartans now saw Athens as the real threat. They still valued their rigid, disciplined way of life, and Athens' growing flamboyance seemed both dangerous and insulting. To a Spartan, watching Athenians spend tribute on theater festivals was like seeing your stern neighbor discover disco dancing. It was deeply unsettling. Yet the Persian menace was never truly gone. Envoys still whispered across cities, alliances shifted, and Persia loomed like a shadow on the horizon. Historians still debate whether Persian gold was secretly funding Greek quarrels, but the timing of certain rebellions suggests more than coincidence. Despite setbacks, Athens continued to act as if destiny was on its side. It treated allies less like friends and more like subjects, tightening its grip whenever anyone showed signs of independence. The Delian League had been born from fear of Persia, but by now it looked more like Athens' personal empire. And the more power Athens claimed, the more resentment simmered among its neighbors. But here's the twist. While Athens stumbled abroad and sparked grudges at home, it also nurtured one of the greatest cultural flowerings in history. Tragedies and comedies filled theaters, thinkers debated the meaning of justice, and artisans carved marble into lifelike forms. It's as if Athens was throwing the world's most spectacular party, while simultaneously making everyone nervous about the cleanup bill. By the end of this period, the Athenians had learned a lesson. They discovered that their reach sometimes exceeded their grasp, but they also realized they were still too powerful to be ignored. Their allies may have grumbled, their enemies may have glared, but Athens had something no one else could match: the largest, most disciplined navy in Greece. And so, the city carried on. A gambler who had lost a few rounds but still sat smiling at the table, dice in hand, ready to risk it all again. Peace, at least on paper, was supposed to settle the Greek world in the years after Athens' Egyptian misadventure. Treaties were drawn, oaths sworn, sacrifices made to the gods. The so-called Peace of Callias was whispered about, an agreement that supposedly ended hostilities between Persia and the Greek cities. Whether it truly existed or not, historians still debate. What we do know is that Athens strutted as though Persia had been checked, while Sparta muttered that Athens was becoming insufferable. The Aegean was buzzing with the tension of a family gathering where no one actually likes each other. Athens tightened control over its allies, sometimes sending in ships to collect tribute when voluntary payments mysteriously stopped. Cities like Naxos and Thassos learned the hard way that Athens didn't take no for an answer. For those who resisted, the Athenian navy could arrive faster than you could say, "Oops, maybe we should have paid the tribute." Meanwhile, Sparta kept its eyes closer to home. Its alliance, the Peloponnesian League, was less flashy but dependable, built on oaths of loyalty and, of course, Sparta's terrifying reputation. If Athens was the chatty, flamboyant cousin, Sparta was the silent one, polishing a spear in the corner. Nobody wanted to poke that bear, but even in times of supposed calm, odd little stories floated through history. One tale claims that during a religious festival in Athens, a flock of birds suddenly descended on the Acropolis, scattering offerings and leaving a mess that priests interpreted as a bad omen. Another quirk: the Spartans, so strict in their customs, once fined a man not for cowardice, not for crime, but for singing a song with too many notes. Apparently, even music had to stay disciplined. Despite omens and oddities, life bustled on. Markets thrived, ships sailed, and philosophers grew bolder in asking awkward questions. What is justice? What is virtue? How many olives are too many for a single bread loaf? Okay, maybe not the last one, but you get the idea. Athens was experimenting with ideas as much as with empire. The uneasy peace also gave rise to theater on an epic scale. Crowds gathered for plays that poked fun at politics, mocked generals, and sometimes even made jokes at the expense of the gods. Imagine politicians being roasted on stage, and the audience howling with laughter. One suspects more than a few leaders left those performances secretly wishing they had banned satire altogether. But under the laughter and the festivals, resentment simmered. Allies chafed under Athens' dominance, and Sparta's allies grumbled about the swaggering Athenians. The Greek world was like a pressure cooker steam, hissing quietly, the lid rattling ever so slightly. Everyone knew something would give eventually. Persia, for its part, watched with patient interest. The empire was still immense, still wealthy, and perhaps most dangerous of all, still very good at playing Greek against Greek. Gold could buy loyalty. Whispers could spark feuds. A bribe here, a promise there. It didn't take much to make the fragile peace feel shaky. Athens, blinded by its own glory, didn't notice the cracks forming. Or perhaps it noticed and chose to ignore them, like someone ignoring that suspicious noise their donkey makes when it walks. The city was too busy enjoying its golden age, too eager to believe that its brilliance would shield it from misfortune. Sparta, on the other hand, quietly sharpened its spears, tightened its discipline, and waited. To Spartans, time was a weapon. They could afford to be patient, watching as Athens spent its energy and made more enemies. By the close of this chapter of Greek history, the world had the appearance of calm but the soul of a storm. Treaties might have declared peace, but the tension was palpable, the rivalries unmistakable. It was less a question of if conflict would erupt again, and more a matter of when. And if you've been following along, you know this story. When two cousins dislike each other at a family feast, sooner or later, somebody flips the table. The long simmering rivalry finally bubbled over, and Greece found itself sliding into what would become one of history's most famous quarrels, the Peloponnesian War. At first, no one wanted to admit it was inevitable. Like two neighbors insisting everything was fine, even as they built taller fences and bought louder roosters. But the sparks kept flying, and eventually the haystack went up in flames. The immediate flashpoint came from disputes over smaller cities caught between Athens' Delian League and Sparta's Peloponnesian League. Think of them as the unfortunate pawns in a chess game where the queens really hated each other. Corinth, a powerful ally of Sparta, grew increasingly irritated with Athens' interference in trade routes. Meanwhile, Athens flexed its naval muscles whenever anyone questioned its authority. It was only a matter of time before Corinth dragged Sparta into a shouting match that could no longer be resolved with words. When war broke out, the strategies were as different as the two societies. Athens trusted its navy and the safety of its long walls that connected the city to its port at Piraeus. The plan was simple: avoid direct land battles with Sparta's fearsome hoplites, and let the Athenian fleet harass enemy coasts while keeping supplies flowing. Sparta, meanwhile, played to its strength, marching armies straight into Attica to burn crops, trample fields, and generally ruin Athens' picnics. Yet, in this carefully calculated chess match, something unexpected arrived. A plague. Crammed behind their walls, Athenians suffered through waves of illness that decimated the population. Even Pericles, the great leader, fell victim. Historians still debate exactly what disease struck Typhus, smallpox, or something else entirely, but the effect was catastrophic. It's a grim reminder that in war, sometimes the deadliest enemies can't be fought with spears. Amid the suffering, odd details crept into the chronicles. Some claimed that cats multiplied wildly in Athens during the plague years, darting through empty houses and feasting on unattended grain stores. Others whispered that a mysterious foreign doctor promised a cure but vanished overnight with a sack full of Athenian silver. Whether true or not, these tales painted a surreal picture of a city trapped between desperation and hope. The war itself dragged on in fits and starts, with treaties signed, broken, and re-signed in an endless cycle of distrust. At one point, Athens and Sparta agreed to a truce that lasted about as long as a plate of figs at a hungry philosopher's banquet. Spoiler: not long. Amid the chaos, smaller states were forced to pick sides, often reluctantly. Some tried neutrality, which usually meant both Athens and Sparta got annoyed at them. Others saw opportunities for revenge against rivals. The Greek world fractured into camps, alliances shifting like sand in the Aegean tide. Still, not everything was bleak. War, strangely enough, also sparked bursts of creativity. Athenian dramatists staged plays that both entertained and scolded, filling amphitheaters with laughter even while the city mourned its dead. Soldiers wrote poetry in campfires' glow. Philosophers debated whether war revealed the truth about human nature or merely our worst habits. And through it all, the ships sailed, the hoplites marched, and the gods were invoked at every turn. Temples received offerings before battles, sacrifices smoked on altars, and omens were read in the flight of birds. One general supposedly delayed an entire campaign because a rooster crowed at the wrong time. The soldiers, hungry and restless, may not have appreciated the celestial chicken's authority. By now, it was clear the Greeks had survived Persia's might only to turn their swords on each other. The unity that once stood at Marathon and Salamis was gone, replaced by suspicion and rivalry. To outside observers, Persia included, it must have looked like a family feud spiraling out of control, with everyone too proud to back down. As the war dragged on, it consumed not just armies, but entire generations, reshaping the balance of power in the Mediterranean. And though Athens still believed in the brilliance of its democracy and navy, shadows lengthened across its empire. Somewhere, someone probably muttered, "Remember when we thought Persia was the big problem?" If the Peloponnesian War had been a long chess match, Athens decided to knock half the pieces off the board and play checkers instead. Their boldest gamble came in the form of the Sicilian expedition, a campaign so ambitious that even Homer would have shaken his head and muttered, "Really?" The idea was dazzling on paper: sail a massive fleet across the sea, conquer the wealthy city of Syracuse in Sicily, and establish Athenian power deep in the western Mediterranean. With Sicily's resources, Athens could replenish its war chest, secure endless supplies, and maybe even tip the balance permanently against Sparta. In short, it was a plan that smelled of glory, olives, and overconfidence. But even before the ships left port, omens turned sour. One morning, Athenians awoke to find that nearly all the city's sacred statues of Hermes had been vandalized overnight. This was no minor graffiti prank. Hermes was the god of travelers and luck. Superstitious citizens saw it as a cosmic "do not proceed" sign. Still, the politicians pressed forward, muttering that divine vandalism could be repaired with a few sacrifices. Spoiler: it could not. The fleet that set sail was enormous, hundreds of triremes, thousands of men, supplies stacked to the heavens. Athenians crowded the shores to cheer them off, convinced they were witnessing the beginning of an empire that would stretch from Greece to Italy. Some even joked that soon they'd be vacationing in Carthage. Meanwhile, the Spartans probably raised an eyebrow and whispered, "Go ahead, please exhaust yourselves." Once in Sicily, things went downhill faster than a goat on a marble staircase. Commanders squabbled, locals resisted, and the Athenians underestimated just how stubborn and resourceful the Syracusans could be. Instead of quick conquest, they found themselves bogged down in endless skirmishes and logistical nightmares. Ships rotted in harbor, morale withered, and supplies dwindled. To make matters worse, Sparta wasn't idle. They seized the chance to open new fronts back in Greece, exploiting Athens' distraction. One Spartan general, Gylippus, even sailed to Syracuse to advise the defenders, tipping the balance further against the Athenian invaders. The climax was as tragic as it was inevitable. The Athenian fleet, trapped and desperate, attempted a final breakout. Naval battles raged in the harbor, triremes clashing like rams in a pen, oars splintering, crews shouting prayers that probably included desperate bargains like, "If we survive, I swear never to complain about barley rations again." The breakout failed. Defeated, the Athenian soldiers fled inland, only to be hunted down in the Sicilian countryside. Thousands were captured and condemned to labor in the stone quarries of Syracuse, under the blazing sun and the gaze of mocking guards. Few ever returned home. The disaster was complete. Athens had lost one of the largest expeditions it had ever mounted, along with most of its fleet and countless lives. Oddly enough, some chronicles claim that in the chaos, a group of Athenian soldiers attempted to disguise themselves as actors, rehearsing a play to slip past enemy patrols. If true, it suggests that even in the darkest hours, Greek creativity knew no limits. Historians still debate whether this was heroic improvisation or just a very bad performance that fooled no one. Back in Athens, the mood turned from hopeful to horrified. Families waited in vain for sons and husbands who would never return. The once proud city now faced Sparta with a crippled navy and shaken spirit. And yet, incredibly, the Athenians didn't surrender. They rebuilt, scraped resources together, and prepared for the next round of conflict. Still, the shadow of Sicily never left them. It was a reminder that hubris, the dangerous mix of ambition and arrogance, could undo even the most powerful of states. One could almost hear a Spartan chuckling. "You didn't need us to defeat you. You managed just fine on your own." Athens had gambled on Sicily and lost. But like a boxer staggering on his feet after a knockout blow, the city refused to lie down. They rebuilt ships, raised armies, and clung to hope. For a time, it even seemed their stubborn resilience might pay off. Small victories here and there gave Athenians the illusion that they could still outlast Sparta. But history is rarely merciful. Sparta, aided by Persian gold, yes, the Persians suddenly re-entered the story like a surprise guest star, built a navy strong enough to challenge Athens on the seas. That was bad news for a city that had always defined itself by its maritime power. Imagine trying to beat Poseidon at a swimming contest. It wasn't going to end well. The decisive blow came at the Battle of Ægospotami in 405 BCE. The Athenian fleet, once the terror of the Aegean, was caught off guard. Their triremes lined up along the shore as if they were on a beach holiday instead of preparing for war. The Spartans swooped in, destroyed ship after ship, and left Athens without a navy. In an instant, the city that had once ruled the waves was reduced to staring helplessly at the sea it no longer controlled. Starvation soon followed. Sparta cut off supplies, and the proud city of Athens, once filled with theaters, debates, and laughter, found itself gnawed by hunger. Citizens boiled shoe leather for meals. Bread became a memory. The glory of Pericles Athens, the builder of the Parthenon, now felt like a cruel dream. In 404 BCE, Athens finally surrendered. The walls that had once been symbols of strength were torn down. Sparta, triumphant, strutted through history as the victors of the Peloponnesian War. But even in defeat, Athens' spirit did not vanish completely. The city would never again dominate Greece, as it once had. But its culture, its philosophy, drama, and ideas would outlive Spartan spears. Centuries later, people would still read Plato and Sophocles, while very few bothered to learn Spartan poetry, mostly because there wasn't much. There is a strange irony here. Sparta won the war, but Athens won immortality. Historians still debate whether this was fate's way of balancing the scales, or simply proof that ideas have longer legs than swords. And now, with the story of Athens and Sparta winding to its bitter close, it is time to slow down. The battles are finished, the cities are quiet, and all that remains is the gentle turning of history's pages. So let us set down our shields and oars, and walk away from the clamor of war. The sails are folded, the triremes rest on the shore, and the echoes of shouting soldiers fade into the soft hum of the night. Athens sleeps, no longer dreaming of empire, but still glowing faintly with the fire of memory. Imagine the city under the moonlight, the Parthenon standing silently above, its columns silver in the night air. The streets are empty now, no footsteps rushing, no arguments in the agora, just the soft whisper of a breeze moving between the stones. The war has ended, and though it brought hunger and sorrow, the people of Athens finally closed their eyes. Even warriors, after all, must rest. And across the land, Sparta too grows still. Victors may cheer, but even their voices soften as the stars stretch overhead. History has claimed its price, and now both cities yield to silence. If you listen closely, you may hear the sea breathing against the coast, gentle and steady, like a lullaby written before time itself. It reminds us that beyond war, beyond victory and loss, life always returns to calmness. Crops grow again, children laugh again, and the world continues. Tonight, as you drift into sleep, take comfort in knowing that even the greatest struggles eventually end. Every storm passes, every battle quiets, and peace, however fragile, always finds its way back. So close your eyes, breathe slowly, and let the rhythm of the ancient waves carry you deeper into rest. The wars are over, the cities are sleeping, and you are safe here, in the gentle embrace of night. Good night.